left off, we'll try and pick up as best as possible.
Well, I think I was asking her a question.
Go ahead.
Chairwoman Williams, are you there?
Yes.
So, again, I think this is a good bill. I think it has a lot of merit. The only thing I would ask you to do, if you wouldn't mind, is perhaps we could add something. If there's no language anywhere in the statute, if for some reason a license becomes, for want of a better term, defunct, after it's been given out for whatever reason isn't used, I think there has to be some mechanism by which that license has to be returned so it's not transferred or what have you.
Sure, I'm open to that. We can work on it tomorrow.
I'll be happy to work anytime with you, Chairwoman.
Gracias, merci, señor.
Chairwoman, do you want to proceed?
Okay, so that would be the conclusion of 5271. 5273, as you know, anything to do with the community of color, whether it's their children, their spouses, their sons, their communities, their foods, it's always a study of some sort to see if it's, fits in the categories that is pretty much deemed as what's normal for some. But this act would direct the Department of Business Regulation to undertake a social equity and race analysis to examine whether racial disparities exist in the process to obtain a state license to conduct business as well as a license to sell marijuana. The analysis would also examine the arrest, the conviction rates pertaining to marijuana and whether racial disparities exist in those rates of arrest and conviction. To determine whether racial disparity exists, a study on whether racial disparities exist in the arrest and conviction rates for possession of marijuana by determining percentage figures for such arrests and convictions aggregated by the following ethnic groups: African Americans, Black, Hispanic, Latino, White, Asian, Pacific Island, American Indian, and Alaskan Native. The department would publish the analysis on or before January 1st, 2022. We all know that there's a financial boom on the horizon with the expansion of our state's medical marijuana program, as well as the possibility of full legalization for adult recreation use. And we also know how unfairly the community of color has been treated in regards to enforcement of past and current laws concerning marijuana. As our society grapples with its sins of inequity and racism, if we truly wish for all to be equal, this legislation is necessary so that those who have been consistently marginalized are not locked out of the potential financial windfall our legal marijuana system will bring to our state. It's no question if it will. It's more of when it does and who all are going to be the beneficiaries and who not. So that's my testimony on 5273.
Any questions from members of the committee for Chairwoman Williams on 5273? No questions. We next move to the witnesses. The first witness we have signed up is Jared Moffitt. Good afternoon, Mr. Moffitt. We're here discussing Chairwoman Williams' bill, House Bill 5273. Please proceed with your testimony and limit it to 3 minutes. Thank you and welcome.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks again, members of the committee. My name is Jared Moffitt. I'm with the Marijuana Policy Project, and once again, grateful to Chairwoman Williams for putting this bill forward. I think that the timing is just about perfect as the state is looking ahead at potentially enacting adult use legalization, but also with the expansion of the medical cannabis program. And the reason I think this study is important is because, based on existing data that I think would benefit from expansion of local efforts to add to national databases, this is probably going to show us that there is a massive disparity not only in the arrest rates, which is, I think, already well established in other studies, but also that there's a racial disparity in terms of the makeup of the industry. And this is precisely what many advocates like myself who are pushing for social justice and inclusion and equity would point to. I think that this study could provide the basis for that argument in clear data, in clear terms that are factual. And so what this would likely show us is that the people that have been arrested and sort of on the receiving end of cannabis criminalization laws are not the same folks, by and large, disproportionately, who are in the industry. I think that we're going to see a very deep contrast as a result out of this study. And so I think it's important to pass this bill and to look at the numbers to see if this is actually what we think is the case, is actually the case. And if it is, I think that it spurs, again, some type of rectifying, some type of restoration, particularly to the people that have been harmed, but also to ensure that the industry itself is inclusive and diverse and not replicating these barriers that prevent people of color in particular from living to their fullest potential and their economic potential. So with that, I just say I think this is an excellent bill and the timing is right on the money. So I urge the committee members to give it consideration and ultimately pass it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from members of the committee for Mr. Moffett? Representative Agello.
Hi, Jared. Haven't seen you or heard from you in a while. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
Good. It seems to me that in the last maybe 2 years, at some point, I heard on National Public Radio a story about the developing retail marijuana business in Massachusetts, and the state of Massachusetts really affirmatively trying to make the business more accessible to minority communities and the sorts of communities that Chairwoman Williams is talking about. And I haven't heard any more since then, and I confess I haven't tried to follow up on it. Do you have any knowledge of what Massachusetts is doing, how it's going?
Yes, and thank you for this question. So there are a number of states, including Massachusetts, that have included what are typically known as social equity policies in their adult use legalization laws. And what we've seen, unfortunately, pretty much across the board, including in Massachusetts, is that these laws that have this aspiration to create a more diverse and inclusive industry are often failing to do so. And there's a very, very robust discussion among advocates and particularly folks who care about racial equity to try to understand why these aspirational goals are not being met. There are some cases of success, but overall they're not meeting what they were intended to live up to. So now we're seeing other states like New York, include much more, I would say, aggressive and focused policies aimed at inclusion and equity in the industry. And we've seen states like Illinois, which passed their law in 2019, again, still struggling at the outset, but many regard it as more promising at this point. So I think what we're seeing is that the first sort of round of laws that were passed to achieve this have not succeeded, unfortunately, but we're now seeing new laws, again, like New York. New Jersey is also notable as well, that are making more concerted efforts. And so I think there's much for Rhode Island to learn from not only how these unfold, but the actual legislative language that's been adopted in some of these more recent states.
Any further questions from members of the committee? Thank you again, Mr. Moffett. Next witness we have is Jordan Goyette. Oh, Steve Brown. Good afternoon, Steve. We're here discussing Representative Williams' bill, House Bill 5273. Please proceed with your testimony.
Thank you again, Chair, members of the committee. Stephen Brown on behalf of the ACLU of Rhode Island to express our support for the bill. There's really not much I can add to what you heard from the sponsor, Representative Williams, say, and Mr. Moffett. We just want to express our support for this bill, express our appreciation to Representative Williams for focusing attention on the social equity issues that really need to be addressed with any further marijuana expansion, including the legalization of marijuana, which we expect to occur sometime this year. We hope that with bills like this, everybody will continue to pay attention to making sure that social justice issues are addressed in any legislation. And with that, I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Brown? No questions. Thank you again. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Next, we're going to look at the 4 bills that address reapportionment or the redistricting for our General Assembly and congressional districts. There are bills introduced by Speaker Shekarchi, Representative Cortvriend, Representative Newberry, and Representative Phillips. I see that we have Representative Phillips on WebEx, and he's been waiting very patiently. So I'd like to introduce all of these bills, beginning with Representative Phillips, and then we can go through the witnesses who may be signed up to testify on 1, 2, or 3 of these bills. So Representative Phillips, you have the floor to discuss House Bill 6211. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Chairman Shanley and members of the committee. This one was sent to me upon request by a constituent, and Senator Pickard is also putting one in the same bill on the Senate side. And it just says that any reapportioning or redistricting has to be approved by a majority of the members of each body before any redistricting can be finalized, and it has to be by the 2 major political parties. My only concern with this, and I didn't talk to him again about it, is that why are we limiting to just the 2 major parties instead of to everyone that's a member of the House or a member of the Senate? And again, that's pretty much what it is, just has to be approved by both bodies and by both parties of the body. So with that, I'll try to take questions, but this, as I said, is upon request.
Any questions for Representative Phillips from members of the committee? No questions, and it appears you have another call to attend to anyways.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Next, we have Representative Cortvriend, who's also been very patient with us for House Bill 5868. Representative Cortvriend, you have the floor. Welcome, and thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. This evening, I'm here to introduce H5868. This bill came to me from Common Cause and seeks to put voters at the center of the redistricting process. While I recognize that redistricting is a political process, this bill makes an effort to improve the process by addressing potential conflicts of interest. And it also seeks to increase transparency and opportunities for public participation. These objectives would be accomplished by increasing the members of the public included on the 18-member commission, including unaffiliated voters who, in many districts, outnumber the members of either political party. The bill attempts to remove people from serving on the commission that may have a conflict of interest, including lobbyists, party officials, and campaign organizers. It expands public engagement by allowing the public to create and submit their own maps to the commission using online programs that may not have even been available when reapportionment was last performed. H5868 increases transparency by requiring that all records pertaining to the commission actions on preliminary maps and analysis of the maps shall be available for public inspection on the commission website. The bill requires a minimum of 4 public meetings, and all communication between the consultant and commission members must be held in public. The bill prohibits districts from being drawn to unduly favor one party over the other. And finally, this bill increases public engagement by requiring 7 days for public comments before any meeting to adopt the final findings and recommendations to the General Assembly. And if you have questions of me, I'd be happy to answer them. But I also think that John Marion from Common Cause is one of the people scheduled to testify on this, and questions could go to him as well.
Any questions for Representative Cortvriend from members of the committee? No questions. Okay, the next bill we're going to put in play comes to us from Representative Newberry, House Bill 6009. Representative Newberry, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to preface my comments by saying that redistricting is one of those topics that I think a lot of people who aren't familiar with the details of it think it's easy to get the politics out of it. It's just the politicians don't want to do it. The reality is, as Representative Cortvriend just said, and I co-sponsored that bill as well, which I think is a good bill, you can't remove politics from redistricting or reapportionment. It's a political act, and there's nothing wrong with that. What you can try to do is make them as transparent as possible and as fair as possible. We're going to be going into this year, this coming fall. We do it every 10 years. There's only 23 members of the House that were here the last time we did it. I was more than most very, very involved in the process. I saw the sausage get made, for good and for ill. And I think that we can do a better job with our process. That said, because it's a political process and I'm realistic about this, I think, and I'm sure maybe some of the witnesses who are going to testify will notice this, my bill, which I'll describe briefly in a minute, doesn't take effect this time. I think as a practical matter, the bill I put out there, which I am not wedded to any particular details of, is something we should seriously consider adopting for use 10 years from now. Because if we adopt it now, the General Assembly in 10 years will not be politically able to undo it. My bill is based on, I believe it's the state of New Mexico's current system. I asked our legal counsel to try to find the most nonpartisan type redistricting bills they could find. I believe it was New Mexico. If I got the state wrong, I apologize. What my bill does is it sets up a commission. It has members appointed by majority, minority leaders, et cetera. It also has members. We chose the Rhode Island Ethics Commission to appoint people. We had the chair be a retired judge. It has all the usual criteria in there for doing redistricting, following federal law, et cetera, majority, minority district, and so on. And then it has that commission select, I think it's a certain number of possible plans, identify all their reasoning, all their explanations in public for why they chose those plans. This is all supposed to be as public as possible, puts it all out there, and then the General Assembly either chooses one of the plans the commission put forward, or if they can't choose, it goes to the default that the commission recommended. It's not a perfect solution. There is no perfect solution to redistricting. For anybody who's watching this testimony, I want you to understand that. There is no perfection here. But this will make it more transparent, less in the control of the consultants, less in control of the leadership of the House and the Senate. Still under some control, but less in control of the leadership of the House and Senate than it is now. I think it'll give the public more confidence that it's being done fairly. I will tell you, I think the last redistricting was actually mostly fair. But I was there. I know I could probably write a book about it, about where the nuances were. And I think the public knows that happens every time, and I think we should try to do our best to avoid that. So I don't expect my plan to be adopted for this year. I know politically that's not possible, to be blunt. But I think we should study it, even if we don't adopt it this session, maybe look at it next session, or even the next 2 years. But something should be done to put a better process in place for 2030. As for this year, I think the Common Cause bill, which I co-sponsored, Representative Cortvriend put in, make some good additions to the bill that we know is going to pass, the Speaker's bill, which is identical, I believe, to the bill from 10 years ago, and is not terrible, but could be improved. So thank you.
Any questions from members of the committee? Chair Corvese.
Lita, you made a statement that if we were to pass this, it would go into effect in 10 years. and it would not be able to be undone.
No, it could theoretically be undone, but
I was going to say,
politically,
because you can't,
No.
because you cannot tie the hands of future legislatures.
no, correct.
So this could be passed, and it could be,
It could be undone, but politically, it would be very difficult for a General Assembly in the year 2029 or 2030 to change it back and make it more politicized. That's all. That's why I'm doing it. I'm trying to be realistic about the politics of this, because the redistricting is the most political process you can find, whether it's this state or any other state. This is not a Rhode Island issue. I want to make it clear. This happens everywhere. We see the disputes about gerrymandering in Congress and everything else. Some states do it better than others. They do it more fair than others. It's always going to be political. If you make it more transparently fair to the public, then a future General Assembly, which may include, as I said, only 23 of us were here. You and I were 2 of them, but we're here 10 years ago. Probably pretty good odds.
actually, we have 3 of them right here.
Well, that's why it's on this committee, I suppose, too. Right, exactly. But you see my point. The odds are pretty good 10 years from now. Most of the people who have been elected in the next 10 years, they're going to have a hard time going to the public and saying, yeah, we're going to take some power away from this independent commission and give it back to us. That won't fly politically, I don't think. Depends
Okay.
who's in charge, depends who the voters elect, but
Okay.
you see my point.
I do. Wherever there is human nature, there's politics. So.
Cynicism is part of politics sometimes. This is the way it is.
Any further questions from members of the committee for Representative Newberry? The other bill we're going to put in play comes to us from Speaker Shekarchi. It would create an 18-member special commission on reapportionment, whose purpose is to draft and to report to the General Assembly and act to reapportion the districts of the General Assembly in the state's United States congressional districts. Signed up to explain the bill is Kimball Brace. And we're going to get Kimball Brace on the phone to testify in just a moment. Good afternoon. This is Evan Shanley from the House Committee on State Government and Elections. We're here discussing Speaker Shekarchi's legislation, and you're signed up to testify. You have the floor.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, it's a pleasure to speak to you again. My name is Kim Brace, B-R-A-C-E. I'm head of a company called Election Data Services, and it's good to be at least talking with my second home of Rhode Island at least every 10 years. We have been doing redistricting in your state since 1983. I've been asked to give you some updates of where we might be looking at from the standpoint of the census. We're anticipating...
The connection's really poor. Can we retry this call?
Sure, absolutely.
Jason, he seems to be coming in pretty well here.
On the WebEx, it's just
On the
not.
WebEx, it's
Yeah, we can't. I can't hear him either.
Okay. All right. Maybe we can wait and see if we can get a better connection with Mr. Brace and then go to another witness.
That's fine. Do you want to connect me via WebEx? I can do that. I'm at my computer.
Well, I'll leave you to discuss with our clerk. When our clerk will get in touch with you, and we'll figure out the best way to get your testimony.
Okay, sounds good.
The next witness we have signed up is John Marion from Common Cause.
Sounds good. The next witness we have signed up is John Marion from Common Cause.
John, can you hear us?
Sure can.
All right. So we're here discussing Speaker Shekarchi's bill, House Bill 6222, but you are also signed up on Representative Cortvind's bill, and she's already introduced it. So if you'd like to testify on both of them, then please do.
Sure. I'd be happy to talk about all three bills, including Representative Newberry's. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm John Marion on behalf of Common Cause Rhode Island, testifying in strong support of 5868, which we asked Representative Cortvriend to introduce, and we're grateful for her doing that. We also support Representative Newberry's bill. It has many great elements to it, and I did hear his testimony in his support of our bill, and we're grateful. Our bill creates a commission, as you know, to redraw the political boundaries using the census data that will be delivered in September. We ultimately think you can remove much of the politics by creating an independent commission, but we believe that ship has sailed because that would have to be done in the state constitution. So in light of that, we do, as our sponsor said, try to take and put in place some anti-conflict of interest provisions so we don't end up with the situation, quite frankly, that we had 10 years ago, where we had lobbyists and party officials sitting as the so-called public members. We also try to shed more light on how the commission works than the leadership's proposal. As you just heard from the consultant who's been drawing districts in Rhode Island since 1983, we don't want his discussions with the commission or the staff to occur behind closed doors. We think that should all occur in open meetings, and this bill would accomplish that. Two more points. One is, as our sponsor mentioned, technology has shifted drastically. I can draw block level districts on my smartphone right now, and our bill would require both that the commission accept maps drawn on other platforms, as well as make public any data that Mr. Brace produces as part of the maps he comes forward with. Finally, the most important feature that hasn't been talked about too much is the redistricting criteria that are in our bill. We do three things. One, we define communities of interest. Even though that exists in the leadership bill, it does not define that term, and we think it's important to define it because that is a key criteria. Second, we put language in to reflect the Voting Rights Act, and the ACLU's testimony states why that is so important. And finally, we say that the commission cannot draw maps that unduly favor one political party. There are ways to measure partisan bias in maps, and some of those measures have shown that past maps from Rhode Island have a high partisan bias, and we think the commission should try to avoid partisan bias. So those are just a few of the things in our bill. I'll refer you to our written comments for more, and as well as our thoughts about 6222 by the leadership and Representative Newberry's bill 6009. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Marion from members of the committee? No questions. Thank you again for your testimony, John.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Next witness is Alex Katsura. Good afternoon, Alex. We're here discussing House Bill 6222. You have the floor to testify. Please limit your testimony to 3 minutes. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm testifying on the redistricting criteria that's contained in Bill 6222. And basically, it requires that census data be used. And what that can lead to is basically counting the census counts incarcerated people as if they were residents of the location where they're incarcerated on census day. So in Rhode Island, that's pretty much the entire state's correctional population counted at the ACI. And when that data is used for redistricting, it results in prison gerrymandering. So the districts that contain the ACI contain much fewer actual district residents and constituents of those representatives than all the other districts in the state. So I have written testimony submitted with the specific language for the changes that would solve this. And there's Bill H 5285 that's in the House right now that creates a procedure to adjust the census data to count incarcerated people at home for redistricting purposes, and this would align your redistricting data with actual voting and residence law in the state, which says that you remain a resident of your home address even while incarcerated. And so basically, no matter how well-intentioned the process of drawing the fair lines is, if the underlying data is flawed and doesn't match your residence with where you're a constituent, then any way that you draw the districts won't be fair and won't result in equal representation. And as an alternative kind of ad hoc approach, I'd recommend requiring that the ACI be split between as many districts as possible to ameliorate the effects of prison gerrymandering in, I believe, the last decade. It was split into 2 districts ultimately, even though 3 districts were proposed in one of the proposed plans. So as many districts as is practicable to split that area into, to make sure that no single district has a huge population in it on paper that are not local constituents. And that's if you don't want to count everybody at home, which would be the ideal solution.
Thank you. Any questions from members of the committee? No questions. Thank you again for your testimony. Next witness we have signed up is Steve Brown. Good evening, Steve. We're here discussing the reapportionment bills. You're signed up to discuss 6222 and 5868, and you have the floor.
Thanks again, Chair and members of the committee. Steve Brown on behalf of the ACLU of Rhode Island. We have submitted fairly detailed written testimony that I would encourage committee members to read. I just want to follow up and emphasize a few of the suggestions that you've heard from previous speakers that we also support in terms of adding provisions to the leadership bill that we think are really important and indeed is essential. One would be to include language addressing the Voting Rights Act, ensuring that redistricting takes into account the voting rights of racial minorities. There have been problems in the past. In 2000, the 2000 redistricting led to a lawsuit that got resolved favorably in terms of addressing racial redistricting problems. We also support the provision in 5868 that would expand access to the records of the commission. We think transparency and accountability is critical when it comes to redistricting. As everybody has said, we recognize it's a political process, but there should be some procedures in place to minimize the politics of it to the extent feasible. And then finally, I just want to urge the inclusion in either bill, 6222 or 5868, of a provision addressing the issue of prison gerrymandering, which you just heard testimony about. Representative Williams has been pushing this issue for the last few years. There are a number of states that have recently addressed the issue. We think it is a very important issue, and this is the time to address it as this commission gets appointed. So we hope that the committee members will consider adding something to eliminate the use of prison gerrymandering as it works on redrawing the lines. With that, I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Any questions for Steve from members of the committee? No questions. Thank you very much, Steve. Next, we're going to go back to Kimball Brace, who is now joining us via WebEx, and hopefully this is a better connection. Mr. Brace, welcome again. You have the floor to testify.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Good. All right. That's very good. It's a pleasure to be with you, even though I'm down here in Manassas. But I do get up to your state every 10 years, it seems like. As you know, my name is Kim Brace. I'm head of a company called Election Data Services. We have been working in Rhode Island since 1983 to help you in the redistricting process, and we're ready to do it again this time. I've been asked to talk a little bit about giving you some updates on some of the data issues. We are heavily into that sort of thing. Certainly the main thing that everybody in Rhode Island wants to know is, do we keep the second congressional seat or do we just go down to one? I don't have the numbers yet, although I will tell you that we are anticipating the numbers coming out within the next 2 weeks. The last week of April is when the Census Bureau will be announcing the apportionment counts. And at that point in time, we'll know whether or not Rhode Island has one congressional seat or has 2 congressional seats. As I've noted before in testimony that I've given up in the state a number of times, you are very, very close. You're only 16,000 people away from keeping it if you looked at the population estimates right now. So you're on the wrong side of that 435 mark, but you're very close to it. So we'll have to see how well the census has been done this time, which is a new twist to everything that we're dealing with and have dealt with in previous decades. With the virus and what's happened with the delays, that's changing a lot of equations right now. It's also a question of how well the Census Bureau actually did the census. There are concerns in terms of counting people and doing a full count. We know that there was concerns up in Central Falls and southern part of Providence in terms of minority counting. And so we'll be looking closely at that sort of thing too. But we won't know that totally in 2 weeks. We won't know that until later on this fall. Currently, in looking at what the commission is being set up to be, is certainly moving forward with the redistricting and getting started sooner than later. We are involved with a number of different states. Some of them are holding back and waiting, but I certainly would not recommend that to be the case. There's some work that can be done right now and begin to be the process of redistricting. So I would certainly encourage people to start looking at and setting up the commission and being able to potentially starting to do public hearings out amongst the population so that you can start gathering information. How well was the census done, for example? Or what are people's views in terms of communities of interest? All those sorts of things could be done over this summer on that side. So any kind of public hearings, that could be started. Now, we will be getting from the Census Bureau further population estimates, not the final numbers, but population estimates at the county and the township level in May and in June. So we'll be able to see where the state lies on that front. If you look at those for previous years, we have in fact seen that there has been a shift going on in Rhode Island. That people, 10 years ago, we saw everybody moving South County. And so the population moving south. This decade, it's actually moving north. And so that will be a factor coming into play on that side. As I said, we won't know in terms of the last couple of weeks of August or the first part of September to have the more detailed data
from the Census Bureau. That is called the PL 94-171. That's the block level data that we will all use to draw the districts. That is later than what happened 10 years ago. We got those 10 years ago in March. And so we're significantly behind time because of the COVID and what's happened at the Bureau. So we won't have as much time for as many public hearings maybe that we would like, but certainly trying to get that moving forward is key. We want to be able to see how well, with this public law file, how well the census and the communities have been counted. As I said, we'll only have one number in 2 weeks. That is the population of the state of Rhode Island. We won't know in Cranston or in Warwick or in other cities and towns what is those populations. Those won't come out until the end of August, first part of September. So those will be critical things for us all to look for. And then we won't have a lot of time to try to get something passed, both by the commission and before the legislature early in next year. I will mention in conjunction with some of your previous testimony that we have over the last several years, we've been working with the Census Bureau on behalf of the state, and we have gone forward to look towards dividing the ACI area into more than just a couple of census blocks, so that we will have more detailed information now, so that we can look towards what the potential is of sharing the territory and sharing the population with a number of districts so that they are not as significant as before. That is why we split ACI 10 years ago, so that it wasn't all in one district. So we now have the opportunity to potentially draw it into multiple districts this time. With that, I'll be happy to answer any kind of questions that anybody might have.
Any questions for Mr. Brace? Representative Newberry.
Hi, Mr. Brace. How are you doing?
Hello there, Representative.
Believe it or not, it is actually a pleasure to see you again. You're always a pleasure and a gentleman to deal with. Even though the last time I think we were in the same room, I was trying to control my temper, but I understand you were just being as my boss used to put it, a spear catcher for others who are no longer in this building.
I look forward to having you in my office again this time.
Yep. No, I'll be back. But I do have a question. I do recall last time, as you said, we had the data by March last time. And I remember quite a bit of work, a lot of meetings involving a lot of people being done throughout this part of the session. I think the public hearings, if I recall from the commission, started, I want to say, right after the end of the session. They ran through the summer and into the fall. I don't want to see us cut down the number of public hearings. They may have to be compressed. But I do think public input's important. My concern is, how much time are we going to have, and we're going to have to do this if the data's not out until beginning of September? Because we passed on the floor last time around, and I want to say it was right before the February break. It had to go through the committee, the Judiciary Committee at the time. I assume it would be this committee this time. And that takes time. So, I mean, how do you foresee this unfolding, assuming we get the data in September? Let's say we have public hearings on the big picture items, but we get the nitty-gritty data. I remember you were put together proposed maps, and how do you see this unfolding as a practical matter over the fall? So we got to get it done, I would say, by December in order to get it into the formal committee process following that, if that makes sense.
Yes, indeed. Good question. We are proposing to, in fact, have some alternative data set possibilities, both the American Community Survey data that the Census Bureau puts out. It's not a full census. It is a sample, but the ACS will start giving us data down at the block group level. It won't be at the block, but it can be down at the block group to give us some clues on where the Census Bureau is seeing population. We're also proposing that we could end up purchasing commercially available data sets. We're using those in a couple of other states. So that would be another way that we could at least start the process That's not going to be for the final drawing, obviously, but it'll start giving us a clue of what could be done. And then when we get the data in late August, early September, we can make then modifications, changes, for example, but at least start the process early, even though we won't have official PL files and PL data. So that's what we're doing in a number of different states to at least not lose this timetable.
Also, thank you. Can you also just comment on one thing? I've been tracking the estimated data too. I'm sure not to the same granular level as you do, but I echo what you said. There's been the overall population of Rhode Island does not appear to have changed very much. What effect it has on congressional districts, I'll leave that to others. But the population shift has been pretty dramatic to the north. Not just shifting north, but I think pretty dramatically to the north. We talked about the last time when you draw maps. I'm only asking this question because we have a forum. I think you're here. It's good to have you explain things to folks who may be paying attention or watching. My understanding is one of the key things is what you call the starting point, where you start drawing the representative and Senate districts. You have to start somewhere, and that has a dramatic effect on what the ultimate result will be. Is that correct? Can you just explain that a little bit, please?
Yes. 10 years ago, what we ended up showing is that there are multiple starting points that might be possible. And what we tried to demonstrate in that process is showing that indeed it could lead to different results. We plan to do that again, to show that and demonstrate that again. And depending upon where the starting point is, could shift where you are, certainly by the tail end when you get to the other side of the state. So that will be something that we'll try to show and let people see the impact of that sort of thing. I'm not saying one way is better than the other way, but I do want to show people how that might impact the process.
And I've got one last question, which may not be better suited, because this is just a legal question, but do you draw, because someone asked me this, I know you draw the maps for the legislative districts that then we look at. Do you also draw the city council districts in the larger cities, or do the cities do that themselves once they have the overall legislative and Senate district maps? I forget who approves those.
The cities do that themselves, but many of them have contracted with us to help them on that side. That is an issue that they will be looking at. And certainly I know I've already spoken before the Town Clerks Association, and I anticipate them coming up to testify before this commission because they are between a rock and a hard place with this delay in terms of when they draw their council districts. Usually what has taken place before is that the state legislature draws the districts first, and then the towns end up drawing their localized districts and try to get those at least following some of the lines so that we don't have what we call pockets all over the place. We'll see how quickly we can get the state done so that the towns have time to do their own. But it's also an issue for the clerks because once all of the lines are drawn, then they have to look towards the precinct boundaries and what kind of precinct changes need to take place and adjustments to the voter file so that indeed the voters will know what members and what districts they are located within and will be getting the right to ballot. That has always been an issue, and we've continued to study that and work with town clerks and the Secretary of State's office to make sure that people are getting the right ballot.
All right, thank you very much. I just want to say, Mr. Chairman, I know that the redistricting commission is not going to be the same membership as this committee, though there'll probably be some overlap. But we need to move this as quickly as I know the data is out there, but this body, our House, whoever needs to move this process along for all the reasons Mr. Brace just said. Otherwise, it's going to be chaotic next spring.
Thank you, Representative. Any other questions for Mr. Brace from members of the committee?
I have a question.
Yes, Representative McGaugh.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Brace, for this information. This is my first time going through this process, and so I appreciate all of the background information that you're providing. My question is, we're looking at a couple of different bills here and looking at some different layouts of some different committees. And as someone who hasn't been involved in that process before, I'm looking for people who have been involved in that process to give us a little bit more feedback about the current makeup or the makeup that we used 10 years ago for this commission versus the proposed makeup of the commission that's been proposed in Representative Cortvriend's bill. I like the idea of having more input from the community and making sure that we have people from the community involved in this process. And so I'm curious about your take between the two different bills.
Certainly, even 10 years ago, we had a number of public members on the commission, which I think was good. I was not involved in their selection or that sort of thing, but certainly having public input, both in the commission, but also at public hearings. I've long been one to say that we need to get out to the public and let them view and let them talk about. And so that's why 10 years ago, we set up a series of public hearings before the data came out so that we could begin that process to let people give some input. Certainly, one of the big things this decade compared to previous decades is called communities of interest. We've developed a tool in the software wise to let people over the internet be able to submit communities of interest, ideas and concepts. So certainly gathering that kind of information, we're looking at all sorts of different possibilities in that regard.
Any further questions? Oh, go ahead.
If we make one more question.
Of course.
Just about talking about the contiguous zones. And I know for my district, and I see it for others, where, looking at the districts, there is certainly a disconnect. I know across to another district to get to the remainder of my district. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and ways that we can maybe work on some of those issues where it definitely looks like there's some funny business going on just looking at the shape of the districts.
Shapes are always an interesting subject, by all means. Trying to look towards where connectivity can take place is probably the best. That's what we've tried to do on that front. It's not always possible. The state of Rhode Island has a big body of water coming down the middle of it, and that poses an issue many times, and sometimes in how you draw the district. Certainly knowing the bridges and how they are operating will help that sort of thing. Certainly when we were looking at Block Island, either putting it into Westerly or coming into the lower part of the bay where the ferries are coming into. That's always something that we're kind of cognizant of, so that you've got connectivity, certainly from the legislators' standpoint, so that they can get to service their community in their district.
Any further questions for Mr. Brace? No questions. Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Brace.
Indeed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next, we have Chairwoman Williams.
Thank you, Chairman. Hi, Kim. Good to see you again.
Hello there. How are you?
Good. And I thank you for mentioning the gerrymandering because it's extremely important. We are in a time that we need to address things that have been overlooked for far too long. So I'm happy about that. But Mr. Chairman, what I want to share is that I'm working on an amendment to 6222. As you may or may not know, I am the sponsor of 5285 that is currently in the House, and that bill spells out a path for Rhode Island to follow New York, Maryland, Delaware, California, Washington, Nevada, New Jersey, Colorado, Virginia, and Illinois, and to end prison gerrymandering by tabulating incarcerated people at home for redistricting purposes. So I was happy to hear about you're going to be looking into it. It's definitely interesting when you say it may be divided up into more pockets opposed to the two that it currently is. So as long as we get done what needs to be done with regards to having those incarcerated individuals counted in their home city or home address opposed to in the A of the C of the I place. To incorporate that solution into 6222, I would suggest the following. Mr. Chairman, in section 1B, at the end of that paragraph, to add the words as adjusted to count incarcerated people at their home residence. Also in section 2C, 1-3, to incorporate the same language, please. And pretty much, 5285 will outline procedures that can serve as a model on how to use the census data along with the administrative data from the Department of Correction to count incarcerated people at their home residence. And Kim, I'm sure that based on your statement, you all already have been delving into some type of plan to deal with that. So with that, I would just like to just say, counting incarcerated people at home for redistricting purpose is sound policy. Both state law and common sense dictate that incarcerated people are residents of their homes and not of the ACI. So it is my hope that, what I just presented will be considered when you decide to deliberate and having my amendment be part of this bill.
Thank you, Chairwoman.
Gracias.
So that will conclude testimony on House Bill 6222. Next, we'll move back to House Bill 5868 from Representative Cortvriend. There are two additional witnesses signed up. We'll start with Jacqueline Goldman, and then the next witness after that will be Jane Coster. Good evening. Welcome to the House Committee on State Government and Elections. We're here discussing Representative Cortvind's bill, and you are signed up and have the floor to testify. Please proceed.
Great. Thank you so much. My name is Jackie Goldman, and I am just testifying on behalf of myself as a constituent. So I really like Representative Cortvind's bill 5868 because I think that it is by far the most democratic process in redistricting and the one that's the least likely to produce bias. I get very concerned about the ideas of these external lobbying groups, such as election data services, from being able to do redistricting. It only takes a quick Google search to see lots of state papers. For example, I'm looking at an article from the Detroit Free Press that names election data services as the Picasso of gerrymandering. And so I think that it's really important to be able to keep these interests out of redistricting because, as we've all noted, this is an incredibly political process with a lot of implications for the state. I think that the other bills, not the one we just talked about, but I believe the one by Representative Newberry, also a good bill, but I think that by far 5868 is the one that is the most democratic, leads to the most disclosure of interest, and is really just the fairest process to making sure that the process of redistricting is as fair and free of bias as possible. So that's all I have to say, and I appreciate your time, and thank you so much for listening to my testimony.
Thank you, Ms. Goldman. Any questions from members of the committee? No questions. Thank you again. Next witness is Jane Coster. Okay, well, we'll try and come back to her maybe later in the evening. Next bill we're going to move to comes to us from Chairman McNamara. It's an act relating to state affairs in government. Chairman McNamara is in another hearing, but he asked me to introduce the bill on his behalf. This bill would allow the public to testify on matters that were previously listed on the meeting's calendar, then withdrawn or held over for future meeting of that public body. Numerous citizens that have prepared remarks and testimony for public comment have been disappointed and insulted when they hear their opportunity to participate in this democratic process has been denied due to last-minute postponement of the agenda item. This practice of moving previously listed agenda items severely limits public participation. This practice also undermines the fundamental democratic principles that democracy and our country were founded on. Thank you in advance for your kind consideration of correcting this unjust process. And there are 4 witnesses signed up to testify on House Bill 6180. The first witness is Roger Durand. Good evening, Mr. Durand. We're here discussing House Bill 6180 from Representative McNamara, and you have the floor. Please try to limit your testimony to 3 minutes or less. Thank you and welcome.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank the committee for hearing this bill. I'd also like to thank Representative McNamara for introducing it. And lastly, I'd like to thank Stephen Brown of Hannah Stern of the American Civil Liberties Union for offering a favorable endorsement of it. I'd like to give you a little background why I've been active and wanted to see this bill introduced. Mr. Chairman, I was spoiled. I attended back in the day, your committee used to be called the House Municipal Affairs Committee. At the time, it was chaired by Representative Craven, as well as Representative Ackerman. And let me tell you, we had a couple issues that we came up to the State House, and they treated us tremendously. I couldn't believe it. So that was the yardstick I used, and I was hoping the way their courtesy as well as their desire to get to the facts would permeate throughout the entire state. So what brought this about was I had in the last couple of years, I've been able to attend city council meetings. And I've seen senior citizens trek over. This is a time when you used to be able to attend them in person, trek over to a particular meeting. And unfortunately, the bill was either going to be held or discontinued, and yet the people did not have a right to speak on the bill. So let's fast forward to what's happened during the Zoom era. There was a bill introduced recently for an expenditure of over $1 million that I was interested in, but unfortunately, I was unable to hit the proper button on my cell phone quick enough, so they told me I couldn't speak. So then I was following the Secretary of State's website, and I found in the next month or so it was going to be heard. So I waited an hour and 45 minutes to be listened to. And unfortunately, by the time it came up, I was told the bill was going to be heard. And I felt to myself, that's not really participatory democracy. So that's probably the idea as to why I think, and I've talked to people throughout the communities in other parts of the state, this is what happens, and I don't think it's done intentionally, but I think that they just don't, they quote the Open Meetings Act as it now exists, that's the way it has to be because that's the way the law is written. Now, I don't know if you've had a chance, you or the other members of the committee, to read the endorsement from the ACLU, the written testimony they provided today. And I'm not going to belabor the point because I know I only have 3 minutes, but they did a great job of describing as to why they feel the law has to be changed, because it's all got to do with participatory government. And listening to your thing, and I'll end on this note, I've been listening to this all day, and you're talking about getting people to the voting rolls and everything else and how important that is. But I also think it's important once the people also to participate in government, when they go to committee meetings throughout the state or commission meetings, if they make the trek to go over there and they want to participate, I really don't think their voice should be muzzled by being told, well, we're going to hold it right now and we'll let it be heard at a future date when it's not heard. And I don't find that to be the standard up at the General Assembly. The meetings I have attended, as I mentioned, with Representative Craven, Ms. Ackerman, and the like, they solicited our opinion on a bill. And they were constantly asking any more questions from the audience. That's not what's happening out in the hinterlands. So that's why I'd like you to support this bill. I think it does what we're trying to accomplish in the General Assembly. You guys set the gold standard. I'm just hoping that could permeate throughout the communities and towns in the state of Rhode Island. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. And hopefully you vote favorable on this 6180. Thank you.
Well, it seems like a reasonable request. Any questions for Mr. Durand from members of the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Durand.
Thank you very much.
Next, we have Donald Fife. Good evening, Donald. We're here discussing Chairman McNamara's bill, House Bill 6180, and you have the floor to testify. Please try to limit your testimony to 3 minutes or less. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. This is about the open meetings.
Yes, sir.
Right to speak. We should have a right to speak. When they bring up a bill and they say they're not going to discuss it tonight, and they delay it 1 week, 2 weeks, whatever, for whatever reason, we should have a right to speak at that moment in case we can't make it later. It's just common sense. That's what I wanted to say.
Okay.
We can speak at that time since we're here. Why not be able to speak while we're here instead of 2 weeks from now? Because we may not be able to make it 2 or 3 weeks, whatever.
All right. Thank you very much. Any questions from members of the committee for Mr. Fife? Thank you again for your testimony.
All right. Thank you.
Next witness we have signed up is Robert Cushman. Good evening, Mr. Cushman. We're here discussing House Bill 6180 from Chairman McNamara, and you have signed up to testify. Please limit your testimony to 3 minutes if possible. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to, echo what some of the previous callers just said, and I don't want to repeat what their testimony was, but what I want to just talk about maybe is from the perspective of an elected official. I'm a former elected official in the city of Warwick. I served on the Warwick School Committee as chairman, so I've had to hold numerous meetings dealing with the general public and trying to be as transparent as possible, but giving the public the ability to speak at meetings. And also I served on the Warwick City Council, doing some of the same kinds of things in committee meetings. And I think what's important about this bill is not only to give the general public the opportunity to speak at these things, but for some of these public bodies to be more accountable to the public. And what I mean by that is that they shouldn't be putting items on their agenda that they're not ready to discuss. And what I've seen countless times in the past is that there will be items that are put on the agenda, and then members from the general public will, just see the little blurb inside the agenda, and it'll catch their attention, and they'll wish to, set some time aside to speak about the agenda item, and it turns out that, the members of the public body maybe didn't have it drafted, and what would end up happening is that they would just basically, move it or delay it to another time. And what's happened in the past is the public hasn't even had an opportunity to speak on it. So that's one example. The other example is where they actually do have some of the legislation drafted, and the general public wants to be able to have an opportunity to speak on it, but there's changes coming or whatever, and the public body ends up holding it again. So all I'm saying is I think this will make the public bodies a little bit more accountable to the public to basically get their act together. And when they're ready to move legislation, before the public and before their public body, it should be ready, it should be written, and it shouldn't be delayed. So that's one point. The second point, I think, is just the equal opportunity for public comment. And, I don't think most public bodies do this, but I've experienced public bodies where maybe one of the members has seen a large opposition growing to certain pieces of legislation. And I've seen this, before the Zoom meetings where you would have a large crowd of people appearing in a meeting. And what they would do is they would hold the legislation so that basically the crowd is disappointed and they can't testify on it. So all I'm saying is, I hope you will support this. I think it's great for transparency. And like I said, it's going to make public bodies more accountable, and it's going to have an equal opportunity for maybe people in the public who might oppose a bill to still have that ability to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Cushman. Are there any questions from members of the committee? No questions. Thank you again for calling in. Last witness we have tonight is Steve Brown from the ACLU. Steve, welcome back again. We're discussing Chairman McNamara's bill on open meetings, and you have the floor.
Thank you again for the last time tonight, Chair and members of the committee. The ACLU supports this legislation. It's really a very modest bill. All it's saying is that when you have public bodies like city or town councils or school committees that have public comment periods, they should not be able to bar a member of the public from speaking about an issue that had been on the agenda, but for one reason or another ends up getting pulled or not being discussed. It's hard to think of any reason to single out that type of comment for not being able to be said at a public meeting. More importantly, we think that there's a benefit to having it. If the agenda item has been pulled for some reason, it might help members of the public body decide whether to bring it back or whether it needs amendment if they hear the public speak about it. So because it is what we think a very modest bill, one that recognizes the importance of public participation, particularly after an item has been publicized as being on the agenda, we hope that the committee will pass this bill and promote public participation. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Any questions for Steve Brown from members of the committee? No questions. Thank you again, Steve. We're going to go back to House Bill 5868. We have Jane Coster on the phone. Good evening, Ms. Coster. We're here discussing House Bill 5868. You have the floor to testify. Please turn down the volume on your computer or whatever device you're watching the committee meeting on and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Shanley and members of your committee. Thanks for the opportunity. Jane Coster, President of the League of Women Voters. And the League is urging you to support House Bill 5868, which will, we feel, open the Special Commission on Reapportionment to more citizen participation in a process which deeply affects their ability to affect the outcome of elections, both of candidates and on issues affecting their lives and those of their children. While we support this bill, we do feel that there are some improvements still to be made in the process of selecting citizen members. From the League here in Rhode Island to our National League in Washington, D.C., we are of one voice when we assert that ultimately the responsibility for fair redistricting should be vested in an independent special commission with membership that reflects the diversity of the state. House 5868 takes a step in that direction by allowing for a third of the task force to be citizens representative of the state's geographic and demographic diversity. Although still appointed by the leadership of the House and the Senate, the citizen members are not to be members of either of the two major political parties. We support legislation that makes the process of redistricting more transparent so that citizens can effectively monitor and participate in the redistricting process, which affects them at every level of representation. By providing mapping software and granting the public the right to submit their own maps for consideration, 5868 establishes transparency and accountability. It requires the Commission to justify its choices with regard to all criteria used to draw the new districts. So the goals of reapportionment under this bill, 5686, not only follows the dictate of the Constitution and the Voting Rights Act, which Steve has mentioned before, and others, for equal population and compactness, but also serves to create districts that are geographically contiguous and respect communities of interest regardless of voting patterns. So this bill specifically adds language to preserve partisan impartiality as well as to require legitimate consideration of communities of interest, including race and language, in the mapping process. And it was interesting with Mr. Bray speaking of all of this. So the League of Women Voters of Rhode Island urges you to support House Bill 5686, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Any questions from members of the committee? No questions. Thank you again. That will conclude testimony in House Bill 5868, and that's the last bill on our calendar, so I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Moved and seconded.
Second.
We're adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.